Welcome to the 7th episode of the exotic tier list. In this episode we will be reviewing Hard Light, which is an exotic auto rifle. Here is the current state of the exotic tier list. You can see there are in fact 7 items already, and that is because last episode we added 2 Legend of Acraces to the list. You can watch that video to figure out why I did that. Despite there already being 6 episodes of this series, this is the first auto rifle we will be reviewing, which is kind of crazy given that Destiny has an abundance of exotic auto rifles. But lo and behold, we've reviewed 2 snipers before we managed to get to an auto rifle. Hard Light does have some quite unique features which we'll get into in a few moments. However, the random fact for this episode is that it is the only exotic auto rifle which shoots at 600 RPM and isn't kinetic. The other 600 RPM exotic auto rifles are Kvostov, Monte Carlo, and Suro's Regime, which are all kinetic, strangely enough. They also all came after Hard Light, so Hard Light is also the first. The first perk of note that Hard Light has is Volatile Light, which says rounds fired from this weapon have reduced damage fall off, over-penetrate targets, and ricochet off hard surfaces. Projectile damage increases after bounce. The other perk is the Fundamentals, which says changes this weapon's damage type, cycling between Void, Arc, and Solar, grants this weapon temporarily increased damage when you apply or gain an elemental buff or debuff that matches this weapon's damage type. So there's quite a few things going on there, but it's really quite straightforward. The Volatile Light with its reduced damage fall off just means that the range is a bit longer on Hard Light. It's not actually as long as you would think, given it is part of an exotic perk, but we'll get into that in a wee bit. Over-penetrating targets means that you can shoot through one target and hit a target behind that one, so you can hit a maximum of 2 targets this way. It doesn't go to like a third or a fourth. You can't shoot through the likes of a phalanx shield, which is very disappointing, and you also can't damage an enemy behind an elemental shield. So if you have like a Vex Minotaur which is protected by a Void overshield, it doesn't damage the actual Minotaur itself, it just damages the shield, but it still shoots through and hits the enemy behind that Minotaur. It ricochets off hard surfaces, which does what it says in the tin there, but it also has projectile damage increases after the bounce, which means that you actually do roughly double the damage if you hit an enemy with a bounced projectile. The Fundamentals then is what allows you to change between Void, Arc and Solar using this weapon. It also applies a bit of increased damage if you acquire or give a buff or debuff of the same element that the weapon currently is, which is better explained with an example. So let's say I'm using Void on Hard Light and I receive the d.a.r.c.i buff. That will then gain increased damage on Hard Light. It'll also, I assume, work, I didn't test this, but it makes sense that if you get jolted, for example, or what is it called, amplified for Arc, you would get the increased damage as well if Hard Light is currently Arc, and the same thing for the Solar keywords basically. Obviously Strand and Stasis don't work because you don't have those options with Hard Light. It's only the light elements that you have those options with. In addition to this, if you gain the buff using, let's say, Void, and then you switch to Arc, you still carry that damage buff over because it lasts for 10 seconds regardless of how many times you switch the element. So that's quite nice, at least. You're not locked into using the element that you've gained the buff with. You can just swap between all the different modes after that point, basically. I do kind of have a problem with these 2 perks though, because I feel like they aren't connected whatsoever. And it almost feels like the Fundamentals has just sort of been slapped on this weapon as like, I can change element, whoa, and that's it. I quite liked with Borealis that whenever you switched between the different modes, it had different like stat bonuses. Even though it wasn't the most noticeable necessarily, it added personality to the weapon, which I really enjoyed. Whereas I feel like the Fundamentals in this case is just the weapon switches between different modes, and if you manage to get a debuff or a buff of the same element you're currently using Hard Light with, you get increased damage, which is nice, but how does that match up with like the bouncing of the projectiles and the over-penetrating targets and stuff? I feel like there should have been some sort of matched up thing of like, maybe the Fundamentals, instead of giving a damage increase, maybe it can debuff enemies. So whenever you gain a buff of a certain element that you're currently using Hard Light with, if you then like shoot an enemy enough times, it gives them a debuff. So if you're using Void, maybe it weakens the enemy. But then because ricocheting does more damage, it gives a debuff quicker. Whereas currently you're just sort of stacking a damage buff on top of a damage buff, which I guess is nice, but it still feels like 2 completely separate perks and they don't really interact. So that's my main criticism of Hard Light, by the way. That brings us on to the testing section of the video, where I've compared Hard Light with 2 legendary auto rifles, that being Adamantite, which is from episode Heresy, and Duty Bound, which is, I believe, from this current season, but I'm not entirely sure. It's a tiered weapon at least, so it's somewhat recent. What we see in the damage categories here is that Heartlight does consistently the least and most amount of damage depending upon whether or not it has the buff associated with the fundamentals perk. So in damage it does 16 and 21, whereas Adamantite and Duty Bound do 17 and 19, for example. Precision damage, again, it does the least and the most. It's marginally the least, in fairness, but it is still the least. Magazine size, Hardlight's 49, Duty Bound's 47, Adamantite's 54. They're all around the same ballpark figure, so that's okay. DPS, similar story, least and most makes sense. Reload speed is the longest out of the auto rifles for Hardlight, which is, I guess, okay, because it's a big exotic weapon, but, you know, it doesn't exactly have much going for it there. The range is the interesting part, because it specifically says in the Volatile Light perk that it has reduced damage fall-off ranges, which to me means that they should be longer than usual, but if anything, this means that it's actually the same range as would be expected for an auto rifle at especially this speed and damage output, because the range is the exact same as Adamantite. Although whenever it has the fundamentals perk thing active, it's actually reduced by 3 meters. This is until it drops its current, like its highest damage output. So when it drops from 16 to 15 or 21 to 20, that's whenever I've marked it as that's the range. I know there could be other damage values within that in the range, which could be extended, but in my books, if the most damage hasn't been extended, like what's the point? The aim down sight speed is roughly the same for all three of them, so it doesn't really matter. Just for confirmation, it doesn't do any of the stuff that Borealis says it does whenever it comes to switching elements, whether it's reloading or aiming down sights. It's the exact same no matter what element you're using, so it doesn't matter. The other interesting thing is switching to another element takes 28 frames, which is about half a second. Heartlight does have a catalyst, but in my opinion it's pretty much useless because all it does is increase the stability from 80 to 100, and 100 stability in this case does not mean it's a laser beam. It just means that it does ever so slightly less recoil than the non-catalyst version, and that's just not worth it for me. I don't know what the point of having this catalyst is. Compared to the other two legendary auto rifles, it definitely has less recoil, but the catalyst is nothing. Heartlight itself just has not that much recoil. That brings us to my opinion of Heartlight, and it can be summed up with, it is in fact an auto rifle. It does feel like an exotic, but there's nothing about Heartlight which screams to me, yep, I would like to use this over any of the other billion auto rifles that are in Destiny 2. In fact, if anything from this experience, I learned that Adamantite's actually quite a nice auto rifle, so I'd probably use that, to be completely honest. I think I would need the perks to be a bit more married up in this case because they just feel a bit disjointed. As I mentioned previously in the video, like there just needs to be some sort of cohesion between the two because it just feels all over the place currently. Given the fact that Heartlight is just a bland exotic auto rifle, I think it really belongs in the bland exotic category of C, along with Cold Heart, which is sort of a bland trace rifle. So there you go. Cold Heart now has a friend. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, maybe even subscribing, and let me know whether or not you would put Cold Heart in the C bland category as well, or maybe it belongs in the trash. Who knows? Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.